He's known as the father of modern lasers, and he discovered laser for retinal condition somewhere in the 60s, for diabetic retinopathy. So since he was already treating diabetic retinopathy, there was a logic which said that, okay, if there is some bleeding in the retina, in the macula, maybe we should use lasers for the macula also. So for some point of time, maybe 10 years, 10, 15 years at that interval, macular photocoagulation using green laser used to be practiced, but this was not a very good treatment to have, because at the end of it, there was a large scotoma which came in the patient's field of vision, and he actually lost vision than what he began with. If you have 6/9 or 6/18 vision to begin with, then after macular photocoagulation, your vision might drop to, let's say, 6/60 or finger counting or something of that sort. So based on this, there was always a need to upgrade your treatment. And in the early 90s, photodynamic therapy came into vogue because this was already being used for certain skin cancers. So there was a logic which said that, okay, let's use this principle for macular degeneration. And yes, that was a good thing to do. It treated a lot of subfoveal lesions with minimal amount, which with not as much as a bad scotoma as photodynamic therapy. But doing a PDT is not a very easy job. I mean, you have to give dyes, and the patient has to remain inside a room for 48 hours. And this also required a lot of repeat treatments, and it was not very cheap either to do. So at the turn of the century, that was when we had the earliest anti-VEGF, the pegaptinib sodium. So with VEGF, something really phenomenal happened. So in a disease which Duke Elder said that cannot be treated and you're going to go blind, we could actually not just stabilize, but we could improve the patient's visual acuity. So then came the era of anti-VEGF. The earliest to be studied was obviously ranibizumab. There were some landmark trials for that, and dosing regimens and all came into play. But these treatments also had a bit of a drawback. These were not permanent treatment. These were not one-time treatments. They had to be repeated at periodic intervals. And that leads to escalating costs. And nobody really knew how long we should continue. Does this get cured? Well, now we know it doesn't get cured. You just need to maintain it in an inactive state. So right now we are at the state of biosimilars, at the stage of biosimilars, and probably sustained release implants of anti-VEGF molecules. So this is generally the timeline of how we've progressed so far. So when we know about the history, it will be a little easy for us to understand the logic behind why we do certain tests, and what information do we really want out of certain investigation, and what are the principles behind treatment of AMD. Okay, so there are certain risk factors, like these are very routine exam oriented slide. What are the risk factors for AMD? Obviously old age is the primary risk factor. People who smoke may have a faster progression of macular degeneration. Sometimes it might be familial. There might be certain genetics in that. People with heart diseases and females apparently have a little higher incidence. So these are the statistics for the Indian scenario. And the prevalence of AMD, late AMD in urban as well as rural areas is almost the same. So what is the pathogenesis? Why does this disease happen? So what happens is there are certain changes which happen in an aging eye. There's ultraviolet light exposure, and there's oxidative stress related tissue damage. So that causes thickening in the Bruch's membrane of the retina, and the choriocapillaries, which are the deeper layers of the retina and the superficial layer of the choroid, they show thinning. So when there's a thickening of the Bruch's membrane, there might be RPE dysfunction, which is like the important thing in the pathogenesis of macular degeneration. Due to RPE dysfunction, it does not process the metabolic waste very nicely, so there is drusen formation. Drusen formation leads to complement activation and inflammation. And RPE dysfunction leads to, because it's the main metabolic layer of the eye, if it's not able to provide for the metabolic demands of the retina, it leads to an increase in the vascular endothelial growth factor. And this might lead to neovascularization and invasion of the subretinal space, and hence cause all the effects of macular degeneration. Also, the complement activation might lead to increase again in inflammatory mediators, disruption of Brooks membrane, and again the cycle continues. So what happens in AMD? Well, this is a disease of the optical center of the eye. So when there is any sort of disturbance in the central region of the retina, it has a negative impact on your vision. This graphic will help you explain better. So that there, this is the center of the retina. This is the foveal dip, and over there is a drusen, and this is the Brooks membrane. So if there is any sort of rupture in the Brooks membrane, which might happen with age, then there is an invasion of the choroidal blood vessels into the subretinal space, and that the blood vessel might rupture, lead to hemorrhage and scarring, and consequent vision loss. So this talk was prepared primarily for a postgraduate audience. So I've stuck to some of the basics. We are not going to go into absolutely heavy statistics and everything. So as a postgraduate student, you need to identify and become very comfortable with examination of the central retina. Clinically, you need to be very thorough with your examination skills, and you also need to know how to interpret certain investigations when you're presented with such a case and you order certain investigations. Okay, and you need to differentiate. When you know what is normal, once you examine the retina regularly, you will identify even smaller lesions. You need to differentiate clinically between a normal retina and an abnormal retina. So what are the signs and symptoms? Well, it's mostly visual. There is no pain, but there is obviously a blurred central vision. There might be distortion of objects. There might be certain patches of vision loss. There might be a central scotoma, and people might complain of interference in daily activities like reading, cooking, driving, etc. So there are two types of AMD, like what we discussed in the pathogenesis. There's a wet type and there is a dry type. In the wet type, there is accumulation of fluid and hemorrhage under the retina. This might lead to sudden and a severe loss of vision. The dry type does not cause a very severe or a very sudden loss of vision, but it's gradually progressive and it may cause a significant visual problem in the later stages. So what we need to understand is who are our patients, who are the patients who suffer from this. So these are typically patients in the late ages of their lives. Now what has happened is, because of an increase in the quality of healthcare and everything, the longevity of the population has increased. If you see a cross section of your OPD, you might see a lot of patients well into the late 70s or the 80s who are very well productive, and in fact they are working and they are doing all sorts of things which you would expect a person in the productive age group to do. So what we need to understand over here is, when we treat macular degeneration, we do it with the intent of maintaining their quality of life. So all our treatments, all our interventions are going to be keeping this central theme in mind. So when we see a patient, what are the stages of AMD? So in the pre-symptomatic stage, well, you might see a few pigmentary clumps or something in the central macula, but then the patient does not have any problems. He has 20/20 vision, and the retina structurally also might not show too many changes. In early AMD, you might see these whitish yellow spots in between the two arcades. So these are called as drusen. They might be associated with pigment clumping. There might be no fluid or hemorrhage in the retina. So such people do not have a very drastic drop in vision, but if you give them an Amsler's, or if you ask them about the quality of their vision, they might say that yes, sometimes there's a little bit of a distortion of a straight line, or a little bit of a difficulty when I'm reading very small alphabets in the newspaper. So these are the typical symptoms of early AMD. In intermediate AMD, what happens is, as the choriocapillary dropouts start progressing, there are patches of retinal atrophy which happen in the center. So that atrophic patch, obviously, when the photoreceptor and everything goes off, there might be some amount of a patchy vision loss that patients would complain of. If you can see the lower picture over there, there's a central scotoma. People are generally able to maneuver around with this vision, but what they would say at this point is, I can see your face, doctor, but I cannot make out your features. I know that there's somebody standing, but I do not know what color spectacles you're wearing, or I cannot see your eyes per se. So those sort of symptoms patients give. And in advanced AMD, what happens is there is a sudden drop of vision. There's a very large patch of darkness in the center of your vision, and these people are quite distressed visually and as well as psychologically. And if this happens in both the eyes, then the patient sometimes might have a problem with even moving around independently, especially things like going up and down staircases, or when the ground is uneven, these people are not very confident of walking. So these are the symptoms of, these are the signs of AMD. So about the diagnosis, there are certain tests which we need to be comfortable with, and certain investigative modalities which we need to be comfortable with. So a clinical examination is of utmost importance. Though in these days and times, there are a lot of investigations and tests which you might have, and you check the retina in great detail. But clinical examination is an art, and all postgraduates should be absolutely thorough with the technique of slit lamp biomicroscopy with a 78D lens or with a 90D lens. You should be able to figure out certain elevations in the retina, whether the retina appears swollen or whether the retina appears thickened or thinned out. So these skills are important important things to be learned. There is some thing on my screen. I don't know why it's coming there, but nevertheless.
Don't bother about that. Chinmay, you can go ahead.
Yeah. So I don't know why that is there, but anyway. So the important test, what we all need to know, and which has really revolutionized the ophthalmic practice and especially retina practice, is an optical coherence tomography. So it's a non-invasive test, and it gives you a very clear idea about the layers of the retina and the pathology what you're dealing with. So this is a normal scan of the retina. Everybody should be familiar with this. There are different layers of the retina which you can make out. Importantly, if you can see this line over here, that is known as the external limiting membrane. Anterior to that, it is known as the inner retina, and deeper to that, it is known as the outer retina. These are the photoreceptor inner segment, outer segment junction, and the deeper layer, this is the Brooks membrane, and this is called the choroid. So these structures you should be very familiar with, because there are certain findings which when you notice those findings, you should actually know in which layer they are occurring. Like something like intraretinal fluid, subretinal fluid, sub-RP fluid. So that kind of holds some value when you're examining a patient and evaluating these investigations. So this test can give us ideas about the different types of CNVM, the exact level of the lesions, and they also help us in follow up when we see these patients and repeat these investigations. So this is a scan of a patient. Now what you need to notice is this is done on a Zeiss machine, spectral domain machine. So this is the vitreoretinal interface. You look at the shape which is distorted, and this hypolucent areas are areas which are filled with fluid. So this is a typical scan of a macular degeneration patient. If you can see over here, there is a discontinuity in the Brooks membrane, and there is sub-RP fluid, there is intraretinal fluid, and also distortion of the retina. This is a pigment epithelial detachment with some amount of subretinal fluid. Similarly, this is a scarred CNVM with possibly some activity at the edges of it. This is again a sub-RPE hemorrhage as well as subretinal fluid. So when you get the OCT done, you should be in a good position to evaluate, to interpret that investigation which you ordered, and then use that information in the treatment of the patient. Okay, so this is a scan for a dry macular degeneration. These are drusenoid bumps which you see on the scan. Now, it's important to notice is this is like a spectral domain OCT. The earlier generation of OCTs was called like a time domain OCT, in which the resolution was even poorer than what you're seeing on your screen right now. So the spectral domain also is not the latest technology. There's something known as a swept source OCT. Okay, swept source OCT gives us very clear pictures about the vitreous, about all the layers of the retina, the layers of the choroid, and even the scleral thickness. So when you have such investigative modalities, it becomes very easy to correlate your clinical findings along with whatever uh, things you're seeing on investigation, and then plan your treatment further. The second investigation to get familiar with is called a fundus fluorescein angiography. Now, before this investigation predates your OCT, and this was one of the main investigations in the treatment, in the confirmation and diagnosis of macular degeneration for a very long time, even before OCT. But what do we do in this? We obviously take a IV line and we inject a dye inside the vein, and then we take a series of photographs of the patient's eye. Okay, so at one point of time this used to be a very important investigation, because if you realize, when I was speaking about the photodynamic therapy era, at that point of time it used to be very important to classify patients as having a classic CNVM or an occult CNVM, because there were some types of CNVM which responded very well to photodynamic therapy and some did not. So at that point of time, having a fresh angiogram, possibly an ICG along with an ICG, used to be very important in the treatment of uh, macular degeneration. So that's the definition of a classic CNVM, and that is how it is seen. So basically, you see like a well-defined area in the early phases, and which increases in fluorescence and with late leakage. Okay, this is again a classic CNVM. You can see it, you can make out the clearly defined lesion along, and as the phases of the angiogram progress, there is a late leakage. And an occult CNVM, in which there were like, you couldn't really see the membrane very well, but there were late leakages of undefined origin. And so that these types probably did not respond very well to photodynamic therapy at that point of time. So what is the relevance of an angiogram today? Do we, as retinal surgeons or as ophthalmologists, do we advise angiogram for all patients with macular degeneration? Well, at some point of time, until recently, I used to, at least for the initial part, everybody used to get an angiogram. But right now, I do not see it absolutely essential to have an angiogram in all cases, because the quality of your OCT and your clinical examination, possibly a fundus photo, documents whatever you have to document and gives you whatever information you need also. And since we are in the anti-VEGF era, we do not really depend on the classification of a classic versus an occult CNVM to plan our treatment, whether it's classic or whether it's occult. If there is subretinal fluid which was not there earlier, and there are clinical signs of activity, you are going to give an intravitreal injection. So where do we do an angiography? Well, we do it in certain cases which you might not be very sure of the diagnosis. Now, this is a 50-year-old lady who had like a massive subretinal hemorrhage. 50 years is not the classical age to have an age-related macular degeneration. Typically, we see this after 60 years of age. So, suspecting some other pathology, I did a fluorescein angiogram as well as an ICG, and as you can see, the ICG has picked up certain hotspots over here. So this pathology is known as a IPCV or a PCV, polypoidal choroidovasculopathy. So this lady was then treated with anti-VEGF, TPA, and pneumatic displacement, and luckily we could salvage most of her vision. Similar findings in this particular lady. Another area where we would definitely do an angiography is a myopic CNVM. Now, in very high myop, sometimes you see a nice coin-like lesion or a hemorrhagic spot on the central retina. So it becomes important to distinguish this from a Foster-Fuchs hemorrhage or whether it's a CNVM. Because if it's a Foster-Fuchs hemorrhage, you don't really do anything. You just observe it and it goes away. But if it's a hemorrhage, then you might go in and treat it. So how to distinguish? Well, you do an angiogram. If it's a hemorrhage, if it's a Foster-Fuchs hemorrhage, it will not show any leakage. But if it's a CNVM, it will definitely show leakage, like what you can see in the fourth picture over here. Fuzzy margins around that central white spot. So that's suggestive of a very small CNVM. So this person cannot be observed. He needs to be treated. Then again, there are some whitish lesions in the subretinal space. So this person had a known history of CSR. On OCT, if you just read the OCT, well, you will notice subretinal fluid, but then he had some CSR type of leakage. So at this point of time, we decided to observe him and luckily settled down pretty well. The third investigation which we need to know, and this is an excellent investigation to have, is an OCTA or an OCT angiography. So this is an excellent non-invasive technique. It gives us the best of both worlds. It gives us an OCT scan along with an angiography scan. Obviously, you do not need to inject a dye. So this can be used in cases where angiography is contraindicated. Very old patients with renal failure, or pregnant ladies, or small children, or generally uncooperative patients are good candidates for this. And it can be useful for follow-up of patients also. Okay, so this is the fourth scan, is an OCTA scan. If you can see, this is the angiography. You can see these lesions over here, and OCTA also those lesions show up. So there's a very good correlation between an OCTA and your angiography findings, at least for the posterior pole. And as the generations of machines keep on upgrading, the quality of pictures that we get and the information that we get out of an OCTA also keeps on getting better and more helpful for us in making a diagnosis. So these are some of the pictures which are used for follow-up. Now you do a baseline scan, and once you start injecting on follow-up, the vessels, the area of the lesion actually goes on reducing, because these OCTA, the images are depending more on the flow of the RBCs inside those blood vessels. So as and when the vessels start shrinking, the signal from those vessels also goes down, and the size of the lesion goes on reducing. So on follow-up, if you notice that there are fresh areas of or the general size of the lesion is increasing as compared to your older scan, then you might actually preemptively want to treat the lesion. This is a little controversial, whether you treat only based on your OCTA or whether you wait for some fluid to happen or no. But as our understanding of OCTA goes on increasing, we might actually be able to treat preemptively before there is any amount of vision loss for the patient. So coming to the management, what are the goals of management? If you have a patient with macular degeneration, what do you do? So you need to understand what are the principles of management. There is you have to stop the disease if you can, or you slow down the disease progression. In a few cases who have wet form of AMD, you want to preserve or possibly improve or restore their vision. And all this we do to maintain the quality of life and the quality of vision in that particular patient. So this is a test, or this is a very simple technology which all postgraduates need to be very, very familiar with. This is known as an Amsler's grid. It is quite simply, on a white background, you have black colored crisscross lines. And it seems like a very simple thing, but it is a beautiful technology to explain to your patients. This is mostly used for home screening. You have to explain how to use it. So what I tell my patients is, typically when patients have some amount of macular degeneration in one eye, and there are signs of dry form in the other eye, I do insist that they do this Amsler's grid probably once or twice every week. And I ask them to laminate this particular chart. I give them a printout. I ask them to laminate it so that they don't fold it and it does not become internally distorted. And you ask them to wear reading glasses, hold the chart at reading distance, close one eye, and notice you see the central spot, and you also see the four corners, and you notice if there are any sort of distortions or missing areas in that black spot. So when you're training a patient to do this, you first ask him to see from the eye which has some amount of macular degeneration. So he will notice some amount of central changes. And then when he sees with the normal eye and he can see an absolutely clear square, then he realizes what these charts are meant for. So what I tell the patient is, this is your baseline sort of visual finding. If you notice anything over and above this, then you need to contact us immediately. So people who have been trained in Amsler's home Amsler's monitoring, they are very observant, and sometimes they might come at a stage where you can very effectively treat them and maintain their vision. There are certain non-pharmacological things that we tell them. You eat nutritious food, avoid smoking. That's the most important thing, because in studies it has been shown that smokers have a very rapid progression as compared to non-smokers. And then there are different ways in which we treat people. We give them certain oral supplementations. In relevant people, we give intravitreal injection. Some people need photodynamic therapy, and surgery has also been tried in the treatment of macular degeneration. So what is a pharmacological treatment? Well, there is an important study which is known as the ARED study. So that has there are what they did was they took people above 65 years of age, and they divided into two groups, matched controls, and so a group got a certain formulation of vitamins and minerals, and then they followed those people up for a period of time. The eventual time for which this study was done was around 10 years, I think, and there have been certain very important outcomes of this particular study. The formulation also has undergone change. Initially, there was beta carotene and certain omega-3 fatty acids in the formulation. In the AREDS 2 formulation, these things have been removed because they were not seen helpful, and beta carotene had an increased risk of lung cancer in a certain subset of people. But what is the logic behind giving oral supplementation to people? Does this prevent macular degeneration? No, I don't think it prevents macular degeneration, but studies have shown that it delays the progression. People who get these sort of supplements might have a little slower progression of macular degeneration than people who do not get these supplements. Okay, so whom do you give these supplements to? Do you give them to a person who's completely blind by macular degeneration, who's got like a large geographic atrophy in both his eyes and who can barely move, 85-year-old grandpa? Do you give them this? Well, it does not make any sense to give him that, because first he was only blind, then after supplementation he becomes blind and poor. So it doesn't make sense to give it to them. Do you give it to a person who is in his 40s and has no chance, who has no changes of macular degeneration, just to prevent the development of macular degeneration? No. So you need to give it. There are certain guidelines in which you give these supplements. So if there are changes consistent with the diagnosis of macular degeneration in either eye, more, early or intermediate macular degeneration, then you might have to start these supplements. It does not make sense to start them in all people above the age of 40 if they do not have any changes of macular degeneration in the eye. Okay, then treatment of neovascular. This I think we have discussed. It makes some sense to just revisit history and know what laser photocoagulation did. So at some point of time, anybody who had a macular degeneration was offered, retinal lasers for the treatment of macular degeneration. Now, what happened is, if the lesion is not exactly in the center of the fovea, it's extrafoveal, and you give them a laser over there were chances that the laser burn, the size of the laser burn or the scar, the laser scar, it generally, we know this, that it expands over a period of time, and eventually the person loses his vision. So there's a large central scotoma which happens, and the patient generally does not benefit visually out of such treatments. I had with my seniors from Shankar Nethralaya, and the discussions in the OPD used to be like, okay, look, you have 6/9 vision. There are two options. Either you just take it easy, we keep you under observation, or you undergo a laser photocoagulation and your vision will drop to, let's say, around 6/60. So these are the two options for you. So from there, then there came an era of photodynamic therapy where, verteporfin was injected inside the patient's vein, and an external laser was given to activate that verteporfin dye, and then it went and sclerosed the smaller choroidal new vessels underneath the retina and led to some amount of stabilization of vision. This did not lead to increase of vision. If you have 6/18, 6/24, you suddenly post PDT may or may not come to 6/6, but it at least stabilized your vision. It did not prevent it from worsening further. But the drawbacks in photodynamic therapy were that doing the procedure was a little cumbersome, and it was not a one-time procedure. So even with photodynamic therapy, there were chances that you might require more than one sitting to control the pathology in the retina. So then, over a period of time, these molecules were developed. The research led to development of anti-VEGF molecule. Okay, and these are the three molecules that we have right now, which are approved by the governing agencies for treatment inside the eye. Ranibizumab, which is also known in the trade name as Excentrix, bevacizumab or Avastin, and aflibercept or Eylea as we know it. And they have different chemical properties and different half-lives and different strengths at which they can bind with the VEGF molecules. So what happened at the turn of the century was there were these two landmark trials which these anti-VEGF researchers they published. These were the Anchor and the Marina trials. So what happened in this was every patient who underwent who was enrolled for this trial, they received monthly injections of anti-VEGF. And if you notice the baseline vision, it actually increased. There was an increase in vision, and it was maintained at least until the end of the trial. So this was quite a novel thing to happen, because until this point of time in history, macular degeneration, the vision could never be improved. It could either be stabilized or it could be maintained. But here we had a molecule which, if you give inside the eye, you could actually increase the vision. But what was the drawback in all this? That monthly injections become too much of a hassle, because there is a risk of a systemic adverse effect. There's a risk of ocular adverse effects, and obviously there's an increase in the cost of therapy also. So after some point of time, people started trying different strategies to treat macular degeneration. So what the Anchor and Marina did was a fixed dosing, that at this point of time, everybody needed to get this injection. In Anchor and Marina, it was monthly. Then people have tried 8 weekly dosages. So at every 2 months, a person goes and definitely gets an injection at that point of time. And there have been studies, I'll come to the studies later on. There have been studies which do compare the data from all these different regimens, monthly, 8 weekly, quarterly. And then there have been individualized dosing. Now, what does PRN mean? So initially you treat the patient with a loading dose, monthly 3 injections, and then you follow that person up monthly. You see him every month, but you do not treat him at that point of time. You do an OCT, you check him clinically, and when there is any sign of disease reactivation, if there's fluid in the retina, if there's a hemorrhage in the retina, if there's a drop in the visual acuity, then you have to treat him. The treat and extend protocol is also like an individualized dosing. So what we do is once we give people monthly injection, we check them at periodic intervals, and we do an OCT. But whenever they come at periodic interval, let's say I give 3 injections, and at the end of the 3rd injection, I call him at 1 month and I inject him at 1 month. Then after the 8th week, I call him at 12 weeks. I increase the follow-up by 6 weeks. I inject him at that time. And so you try and increase the duration of follow-up, but then you inject at every visit whenever the patient follows up with you. So what are the advantage of this treat and extend protocol? Well, it reduces the monitoring visit. And this, according to studies, has possibly been the best modality or the best protocol to treat people with macular degeneration. Yeah, so these were just some of the studies which I was explaining to you. So what we have to understand is there are certain challenges which with fixed dosing. There's a risk of over treatment. If you treat like monthly injections, then there's an increased risk of having serious ocular adverse effect or also systemic adverse effect. And if you undertreat, then there are suboptimal outcomes. So despite the patient coming to you for a regular follow-up as and when you called him, he might still end up losing vision. So there has to be a very important balance between when to call the patient and when to treat the patient. These are the different clinical trials which have dealt with this particular question, that how frequently should we call the patient and how frequently should we inject the patient. To describe each one of them would really be out of the scope of this particular lecture. But currently in most of the retina meets today, and even in our Bombay retina discussions, most of us agree that a treat and extend protocol would be what is the most appropriate for managing or ARMD patients. So then there are other management tools which you can employ. Some people, unfortunately, despite what you do for them, might still end up losing vision. So you need to orient them and need to train them, or have somebody come over who can do a low vision aid test, because this also does improve their quality of life and the scope of activities which they can do. You need to counsel the patient regarding the nature of the disease, what to expect after treatment, importance of regular follow-up, and also compliance with treatment. This is one of the main thing which leads to patients to drop out. It might be related to the cost, it might be related to so many other things, but you need to keep on explaining to them about the compliance, to maintain compliance with treatment. Because if they, once they get good vision, once they get 3-4 injections and they come back to probably 6/9 or 6/6 vision, then they possibly think that now we do not need to go for a regular checkup, and I will only go when I find some problem with my vision, which is like a wrong concept. Because by the time they have a problem with their vision, they might actually be at a stage where improvement might not be possible at that point of time. Yeah, so then you also need to have trained patients in self-monitoring of the vision. Home Amsler's monitoring is a very important tool to explain to the patient, so that they can, even at the comfort of their homes, they know whether they're having any disease activity or not. And certain lifestyle modifications. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chinmay. It was very nicely covered all the important aspects of age-related macular degeneration. We have a few questions which we'll be answering now. First question is, what are the types of drusen?
Okay.
How do you differentiate clinically?
Just a minute. Is it typed? Okay, I can speak this out, right?
Yeah. You can just come out of this share slide.
Stop share.
Stop share. Should I do stop share?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So the types of drusen, you really want to differentiate on the size of the drusen. So there's a small, intermediate, and a large drusen. It depends on, basically there are certain less than 65 microns, 65 to 120, more than 120 microns. But you cannot go with calipers and all that and measure every drusen inside the retina. So for a clinical thing, if you have an intermediate drusen, which is kind of the width of that drusen is described as much as the diameter of your retinal vein, that would be an intermediate drusen. It has been shown that people having intermediate drusens and above, large drusens and intermediate drusens, they are more of at a risk of having a conversion from a dry form of AMD to a wet form of AMD. So those people you have to counsel a little more, that, look, you might actually notice all these symptoms. So if you notice something of this sort, then you need to come to us quicker.
Also, I would like to add, you can also classify the drusen as soft drusen, hard drusen, and calcific drusen, and even a diffuse type. Okay. Next question is whether classic and occult, which is type 1 and which is type 2. That is answered, but again, for everyone, we'll just say type 1 is the occult type and type 2 is the classic type.
Yeah.
Okay. Clinically, how do you diagnose that patient is having ARMD? Clinically.
See, clinically, like I told you, a dry AMD will have certain whitish yellow spots on the retina. These are known as drusen. There might be certain areas of hyperpigmentation on the retina. So these are the defined clinical signs of dry AMD. For wet AMD, there might be certain subretinal, there might be elevation of the retina. You need to be able to understand thickening of the retina. There might be hemorrhage underneath the retina. There might be certain fluid collection, fluid pockets underneath the retina, or there might be certain areas of scarring already. Sometimes you might notice a scar on the retina at the edge of which you're seeing some hemorrhage or some fluid. So those are the clinical signs of a wet AMD.
Okay. Then is TPA given intravitreally?
Well, yes, we do give TPA cases where the hemorrhage is very large. So the principle in giving a TPA is generally given along with a gas and an anti-VEGF agent. The principle is that when there is a hemorrhage in the central area of the retina, the products of heme breakdown, the iron, the hemosiderin and all, they are toxic to the photoreceptors. So you want to move the blood away from the posterior pole as quickly as possible. So if there's a fresh bleeding, generally within 2 or 3 days, the blood starts clotting and it does not move. So if it's a very fresh hemorrhage, sometimes you just need to inject a small bubble of gas with a prone position for the patient and the blood just moves off. But if it's an older hemorrhage, then we do give intravitreal TPA along with gas and anti-VEGF, and the patient has to maintain strict head down position. And more often than not, you do see that the blood liquefies and it moves away from the posterior pole.
Other thing is if treatment is same for ARMD and for PCV, then why you want to differentiate?
Yeah, so interestingly, since see what has happened is possibly this is what I feel, that there are some cases of which we used to call as an occult CNVM, which might actually be some forms of PCV. Now, since we in the early period we did not have enhanced depth imaging, we could not really image the choroid and all very well. But now, since we have that, we are noticing that there are certain forms of AMD which are associated with a thickened choroid. Now, these we have started classifying as a pachychoroid spectrum. And there are, in the pachychoroid spectrum, we consider CSCR, PCV, and so many, 2, 3 other things also. So as our understanding of these things is evolving, so does the differentiation also is becoming quite narrow. So there might be a point in the future where we really do not need to differentiate between AMD and PCV, and the treatment might be kind of similar only. Interestingly, since you asked this question, photodynamic therapy, which was almost on its way out, since we have now started diagnosing PCV and we've had these investigative modalities which show us those beautiful polyps and all, some of us have actually restarted doing photodynamic therapy when we notice these polyps and branching vascular networks.
And also, I would like to add, we have to differentiate. Supposing you are giving injections, eccentrics to the patient, and you're not finding any response, then it's better to do ICG or Octa and diagnose PCV. Once you have diagnosed, then we before trying PDT, patient cannot afford, we can always try injection Eylea, aflibercept.
Yeah.
And that works better for PCVs than only for simple ARMDs.
Yes, that's true.
Okay, antioxidants for dry AMD, how long will you live?
So these are nutritional supplements. Ideally, they should be continued throughout life. There is no particular thing that you give it just for a period of time and then stop it. This has to be continued throughout life. So initially, I think what we used to do is we used to give certain drugs for 3 months and then take a 1-month break, and all these were with the older formulations which had beta carotene and everything, because we needed to reduce the concentration of beta carotene. But right now with the current medications, I do not see any point in giving it for 3 months and then stopping it off. I think you can just ask them to continue whatever the recommended dosage are right throughout their lives.
We have to be careful in smokers.
Yeah. So right now, madam, most of the things do not contain beta carotene. Most of the formulations do not contain beta carotene, and formulations with beta carotene in smokers is what we used to avoid
Actually, most of the antioxidants which are available are not as per the AREDS
None of them are, yes.
formula,
None of
except
them.
one which has come now, that is Ocubless.
Yes.
But you have to
yes.
take 2 tablets,
In
then
a day,
it
yes.
fulfills the AREDS 2.
Yeah.
So that is one thing. And just for PGs, there are also trials which are going on where the antioxidant drops have been tried. And if that becomes a success, then that will work not only for ARMD but also for cataracts and other things. So that is also being tried. Okay. Now, if patient is having counting fingers and he's got a CNVM, should you treat? Baseline vision is just counting fingers.
He might not be. See, what we need to understand over here is we are trying to preserve his field of vision. He is not going to improve vision. That is one thing which you should be very clear to the patient before you start treatment. This whatever injections we are giving you, you might not have any benefit on your vision. But if the scar on your retina goes on increasing and your peripheral field of vision goes on getting bad, then there is no way in which we can reverse it once the scar is high. So what happens is there are many factors in play with this. You need to understand how his other eye is. What are the activities that this patient is doing. If he's anyway a bedridden patient and he's not doing too many things, I might not be very keen on putting such a patient underneath, giving him injections per se. But if this person is moving around, he is not very old, he's able to maintain his peripheral field of vision with those injections, a decent amount of vision, he's driving and all that, and he's able to move around, he has an active lifestyle, then in those few cases I might actually treat such patients. Not all patients though, mostly patients with CF 2 meters vision and all, I would not ask them to undergo treatment.
Madam, can I add one point here?
Sure.
Yeah.
Whatever Chinmay has said, I second that. But nowadays, with the OCT being used so often, the imaging of such cases has improved the decision making in a big way. There is if you see, there are certain OCT markers, like if there are outer retinal tubulations, they are like they appear like cysts, but it's not actually intraretinal fluid. These are degenerative areas where the neuronal elements have lost. And there is also a case where histopathology study says that it is actually scrolling up of the external limiting membrane. So, and if there are these findings on top of a scar, which is easily seen in the OCT, also there is transmission defect because there is a scar. The image of the choroid below it is not as good. So if we have these OCT features, then I would not treat the patient. However, if there is a scar with a bleed at the edge of the scar, that would point that the scotoma which already is there is going to increase. So only in those circumstances, with explaining the patient everything, I would treat the patient. But as Chinmay rightly put it, most of the times we leave these patients alone and just call them for follow-ups to see whether any worsening of the peripheral vision is there or not.
Sometimes I would like to add, you get scar which clinically looks the patient will not improve and patient will have finger counting vision. And if you give a trial of anti-VEGF, sometimes, if they're finger counting, they can come to 660 and 636 also. So that becomes useful, especially in one-eyed patients. So there's no harm in explaining to the patient the prognosis and just giving a chance in such patients. Okay.
Yeah, that's true, man. The problem what happens is more like a practical issue, that you might feel that okay, finger counting to 660 is a very significant improvement, but a patient they always start expecting a little more. So most of our decisions these days, at least in private practice, they are also with regards to our previous experiences with such patients. So you have to be very clear. If the patient is insisting that, look doctor, let's take a chance, if it improves, well, I'm lucky. If it doesn't improve, then let's just leave it. Then we have given such patients certain injections, and if they're happy with it, if they're happy in maintaining that sort of vision, then we have continued in such patients also.
So counseling is very important.
It's very, very important, yeah.
Okay. If it's a non-exudative AMD, then how do you manage? Should you give or you observe?
Non-exudative AMD, it's a previously treated AMD. There are two instances in this. If this is a previously treated AMD, small scar and it's dormant, it's not doing anything, a patient has good vision, 6/6, 6/9, maybe there are no distortions, then yes, we do observe. We call them at periodic intervals, we see them clinically, we do an OCT. Or if we notice objectively some changes in the OCT, then again we need to restart treatment. Or if the patient notices that, you know, I'm having some distortions, then he comes earlier to whatever his scheduled visit is, and then you do an OCT and see if there's any treatment. The second thing is, if it's a dormant, if it's a non-exudative CNVM, but you've caught it on a routine examination and you've probably confirmed it on a OCT angiography, then do you treat or not treat? That's a little bit of a controversy.
Quiescent
Since
CNVM.
Swapnesh is there, what would you do, Swapnesh, in such a case?
So this particular entity is called as a quiescent CNVM.
Exactly.
Which is the recent entity. And
Yeah.
on Opta, we see these vessels which are forming, and we follow up these patients every month, every 2 months. And if the vessels are maturing or they are growing in size, then taking the patient into confidence, then we can give an injection to the patient. But all this is still in a very nascent stage. There are not much
So
studies
there are
on.
arguments on the other side also, that yes, you want to observe this patient every month and all. Supposing at some point of time he does not come to you, or he's unable to come to you for some reason, and the next time that you see him is when he lands up with a massive subretinal hemorrhage. So would you feel that you should have really treated him when you had the opportunity or not? So these questions, I think we will always keep on facing and dealing with as we get more experience. But currently, if I see on Octa, if I see a possible quiescent CNVM like what Sapnesh has said, I would somehow not be very keen on injecting right now. At least that's my take on this.
But non-exudative also means a dry AMD. Supposing it's just Duchenne and it is in the
A
early
dry
Duchenne,
AMD, if it is there and there is no breach in the Brooks layer, then we are advise them home Amsler's monitoring and a routine examination, just a routine follow-up.
and we can start on
Antioxidants, yeah.
Antioxidants. Okay, then whether suprachoroidal anti-VEGFs have been given.
Well, suprachoroidal steroids I've heard. Suprachoroidal anti-VEGF I've never really heard of. Swapnesh, you have any?
Yeah, but it may become a modality.
It may, if we have, but
I have given suprachoroidal steroids.
Yeah, suprachoroidal steroids for certain uveitic conditions and everything we have given. But anti-VEGFs, I do not remember coming across such a study or such experiences.
Okay. Then surgeries for ARMD.
So at some point of time, so we have done certain surgeries for ARMD. That is, if we had added that, it would have been like a massive lecture today also. But this is done when there is a massive hemorrhage throughout the retina, either with secondary to a PCV or a big large ARMD bleed. So I was in discussion with Dr. Nishikant Borse. What he does is he injects TPA and gas and anti-VEGF, not in the vitreous. He does a vitrectomy and injects this underneath the retina through a 41 gauge needle. And that has a very beautiful displacement of the hemorrhage from the posterior pole. And that's one of the surgeries which is currently exciting. There have been other studies, other surgeries also done in which, you know, there's an attached retina and there's a hemorrhage on the posterior pole. So you cut the retina 360 degree, you detach the retina, and then you remove the hemorrhage, remove the scar, and then put silicone oil and again attach the retina. This is with respect to you know, preserving your central field or translocation of the retina. But I do not think that those surgeries really took off. I do not think that those surgeries are being practiced widely right now. So yeah, surgeries right now for retinal macular degeneration, other than this subretinal injection of TPA, gas, and anti-VEGF, other surgeries I would not find them very exciting right
now. How often the dry ARMD becomes wet? And what is the chance of wet ARMD in the fellow eye?
Yeah, so there are certain numbers to this. Yeah. So there are, I think around 20% of this is from some study that I'm quoting. I do not know the exact numbers, but I think around 20% of dry AMD can convert into a wet AMD form.
If I can add,
Yeah.
obviously, I also don't remember the statistics.
Yeah, statistics are a little difficult to remember. Yeah.
But there is a recent, just to ignite a discussion, there is a recent concept. I have also learned it recently. There is something called as a Drusen ooze.
Okay.
In a dry AMD, they have classified Drusens into various forms, and there is something called as a conical Drusen, sawtooth Drusen, and our usual Drusens. So in a conical Drusen, what happens is the Drusen actually doesn't look a dome-shaped Drusen. It's a conical Drusen, and in these Drusens, there is more chance that whatever material which is collected inside the Drusen, it rips through the RPE and it enters the subretinal space above the RPE. Now, when this happens, it is a marker that the dry AMD in this particular patient is more likely to turn into a wet AMD. So this is from a recent study which they have tried to classify Drusens based on only enhanced depth imaging OCT. So there is one marker which can help us. We have to look
so
at.
Interestingly, when you have enhanced depth imaging, once you're able to have very high definition images of all these smaller pathologies, your understanding and possibly your treatments also keep on evolving.
Yeah, there's one more thing that they describe this. There is reverse polarization of these deposits. Usually, you would have a drusen and you would expect everything to collect at the RPE level, at a level because the materials are going towards the choriocapillaries. But when you find that there is a PED or a drusen and the collection of the material is more towards the retinal side, that is called as a reverse polarization of the deposited material, which is again a bad prognosis and a chance of converting a dry AMD into a wet AMD. So again, recent studies we have to take it with a pinch of salt.
When you find an amorphous material under the retina, what is the chance of that for visual prognosis?
Yeah, so I think these are just some drusenoid deposits which I think they're referring to underneath the retina. So if it's in the early stages, well, there might be no visual symptoms in that because these are typically signs of early AMD. So if there's just drusenoid deposits underneath the retina, there are people who have maintained 6x6 and N6 vision right throughout their lives also. But if you need to monitor these patients, again, the importance of monitoring and explaining to them about the importance of follow-ups is very important over here, because there are chances that some people, like what Swapnesh said, there are certain morphological characteristics which might evolve with time, and they might actually convert into a wet form. So just a pure amorphous sort of to answer this question, just amorphous deposits underneath the retina, we would not really do too many things. I would typically do a fundus photography. I would run a baseline OCT, explain very clearly the patient about home Amsler's monitoring, and probably check him. I would call him in 6 months' time. If after 6 months he's absolutely at the same level where he was 6 months before, then with a very clear understanding of home Amsler's monitoring, I would ask him to come for an annual review.
The thing is, if after 3 loading doses of aflibercept, if the fluid is stable, vision is not improving, then should we continue to treat and extend, or what should we do?
If after 3 doses the fluid is not going, is that the question?
Yeah.
Fluid is not
after
going.
After 3 doses of Eylea, if the fluid is not going and vision is not improving.
After I then would again review all his investigations. I would possibly repeat an angiogram, or if an angiogram has not been done before, do an ICG, do FFA along with an ICG, and if it shows some amount of a deeper vasculature, if it shows a branching vascular network or a polypoidal thing, then I would introduce photodynamic therapy into this person's treatment. If he was initially being treated with, let's say, an Avastin or something, I would change the anti-VEGF and go for a ranibizumab or a aflibercept, and then particularly see how his response is. So there are certain cases which are possibly presumed to be macular degeneration, but there are cases who I have seen in my clinical practice are just cases of long-standing CSR who have gone out the whole spectrum. They start off with Nepafenac, and Nepafenac does not show anything. Then they go with Avastin. Then they have ranibizumab. Then they have Eylea. So sometimes there might even be a small dip in the volume of the SRF, but this SRF really doesn't go away. And interestingly, in these long-standing cases where there's fluid underneath the retina, whatever you do, even if there is a structural change, if the SRF goes down also, the photoreceptor layer is kind of wiped out. So there might be not too much visual improvement for this patient. So at some point of time in these particular cases, we might be forced with the idea that now, despite everything, we will just observe this patient and not do anything further.
Is there any difference between dry ARMD and non-exudative ARMD? How you differentiate?
I think
it's a repeat.
Yeah. These are terminologies. Basically, the meaning is one and the same. There are in the nomenclature of ARMD, it has been exudative, non-exudative, senile degeneration, this, that. So I think there was a paper which came probably from Januzzi group. I'm not really sure about the authors. I think it's from Januzzi, who gave very clear-cut definitions of AMD. So it was called as dry AMD and wet AMD. So all the other terminologies, whatever we have been using, exudative versus non-exudative, fit into this particular criteria. If there is some amount of fluid, if there is some amount of hemorrhage or thickening of the retina, it's an exudative, it's a wet AMD. If there's no fluid, if there are certain drusenoid deposits, hyperpigmentation and all those other things, foveal thinning, then it's a dry AMD.
I think what Chinmay said is absolutely right. To make it simple, in a treatment naive patient, both are the same.
Yeah.
In a patient who is presenting for the first time, dry AMD and non-exudative AMD is the same.
It's the same thing.
Madam, should we close the lecture?
Yeah, it is done. Chinmay can just summarize it in short, the treatment part at least, because it is a little difficult.
Yeah. So the treatment part, well, for dry AMD, you need to understand that the patient needs to be taught about home Amsler monitoring. He needs to be explained that even though his vision is good right now, there are chances that he might actually be a candidate where his vision might go down. So he needs to understand what are the symptoms of early vision loss. He needs to be explained home Amsler's monitoring, and he needs to be given a plan of action. Supposing he sees these particular symptoms, then he needs to contact his doctors immediately. So in a person who has a wet AMD, it's important to start off intravitreal injections of anti-VEGF. That is the drug of choice. That is the primary treatment right now. It is not laser. It is not photodynamic therapy. It is anti-VEGF injections. Regarding the choice of injections, well, there are studies which promote one and do not promote the other. But if you ask me personally, any sort of anti-VEGF injection has kind of equal outcomes. Whether he gets Avastin, whether he gets a ranibizumab, whether he gets Eylea or Accentrix, anything. What you need to understand is, if there's a wet AMD, you need to start treatment early, and you need to. What we generally do these days is we give 3 monthly injections. Those are called as the loading doses, and then we follow a treat and extend protocol. So after the third injection, I call my patient at around 6 weeks after the third injection, and then give him an injection at that point of time. After that injection, he comes 8 weeks, and then 2 months after the last visit, and then he gets an injection at that point of time. So that way, you generally gradually keep increasing the duration of follow-up, and every visit that the patient comes, he gets an injection. And whenever the follow-up is increased, the patient needs to self-monitor himself more effectively. He needs to do an home Amsler's monitoring. So if he notices any change before his scheduled visit, then he comes earlier.
And if we cannot treat and patient's vision drops, then we should never forget the low vision aids, which can help
Yes,
the
low
patient to
vision aids are
carry
very
out his day-to-day activities.
yeah.
And even when the patient is on injection, whether patient is on treatment and extend protocol or PRN, patient should follow up every month. So at least we can
Yes.
catch the disease if it is recurring earlier. Follow-up should be on OCT and on best corrected visual acuity, both distance and near. So there's one more question. Do patients, 1 minute.
Patients on wet AMD require multivitamins.
Sorry.
Whether they require multivitamins. Yes, you can give tonics, always better.
Sumit?
Yeah. Thank you,
So
Chinmay
we can-
sir, Saroj ma'am, and Swapnesh sir for wonderful lecture. Tomorrow at 8 o'clock, we have next lecture in the series, that is infective keratitis by Dr. Rashmi Shukla. It will start at 8 o'clock tomorrow.
Sumit,
Thank
I
you.
want to ask a question. Sumit is the coordinator for PG series. He has just operated and come and joined our session. Sumit, what was your OT dress like when you were operating in this COVID era?
That's an important question.
It was just like an astronaut, sir. I was wearing normal OT gown. Above that, there was a PPE kit with total head thing. There was a protective glass and the shield all together. So I can just tell you that after finishing the surgery, I was totally wet from my head to toe.
Could you see the microscope, Sumit? Could you?
No, I did not use the microscope. It was basically a wide excision biopsy.
Acha, okay. It
So
was
I managed without microscope.
So you wore the PPE, which was a gown type or the pant type?
It
That
was
would be
gown
the
type,
difference.
gown type with the
Gown type is comfortable.
leggings, yeah.
But protection is less in that gown type because we have used both types.
So they had extra leggings which come to your knee. So I
Yeah.
was wearing both along.
I'm sure you were not wearing the leggings.
No, I was.
You should.
Thank you, madam.
And COVID test was done pre-op.
Yeah.
Yes,
Did
ma'am,
you
it
do
was.
COVID test?
Yes.
I think
It was
that's
like- that's
prerequisite now.
protocol. Yeah.
Thank you, madam.
Thank you, everyone.
Chinmay. And
Thank you,
Sumit.
madam. Thanks, Swapnesh.
Thank you, Chinmay. It was very good. Thank
Thanks,
you.
ma'am. Thanks a lot.
All of you can revisit this lecture on YouTube. We have a BOA YouTube channel, BOA iTalk plugged in. So please subscribe. Thank you. Thank you, madam. I'll end the
Thank
meeting
you.
with your permission.
Yeah, sure. Thank you.